Dad, are you ready? You ready for your first question?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Welcome. It's so good to have you on the show. Can you take us back to the beginning of this story? The Isle of Wight Festival. What inspired it? And what were the initial challenges in bringing it to life? Because, you've had this idea, but then it became something absolutely massive. What on earth made you decide to put on a festival on the Isle of Wight?
It actually started by accident. My brother Ronnie, who he took on a part-time job as a fundraiser to raise money for a swimming pool in the Isle of Wight. And in casting around for ideas on how to raise money, it got to the point of putting on a one-day festival of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that was the start of it. So it did kind of start by accident. I got involved fairly quickly. I had a printing business at the time, and I was printing all the tickets and publicity material and things for it, and generally getting involved. The Swimming Pool Association didn't like the look of our festival. They thought we were going to get lots of drugs and sex and rock and roll coming to the Isle of Wight, and they disconnected from it and advertised in the local paper to say it was nothing to do with them anymore. And they just handed it over to us. Well, the first event was kind of okay. We broke even just about, with about 10,000 people came. We had the Jefferson Airplane and Crazy World of Arthur Brown on the bill, who were quite big names then, and still are, in fact. And we learnt from that, if we were going to do it again, which we wanted to do, we had to kind of get over the big problem we had in the Isle of Wight, which is that, first of all, Isle of Wight people don't support anything. And secondly, to get people to come from the mainland, you've got to put something on that you can't normally see on the mainland. It's got to be a special thing. And we were looking for a big act, a really big star. And there weren't many big stars around. I mean, we had Jefferson Airplane, as I've said. Anything bigger than Jefferson Airplane, you went to the next league, of which there were kind of like the Beatles, Bob Dylan, Elvis Presley, and that was about it, really, at that kind of league that you would never normally see in a concert hall on the mainland. And now, obviously, the Beatles were splitting up. Elvis Presley was completely unsuitable anyway, and obviously inaccessible. It left Bob Dylan. And we made a bid for Bob Dylan. I was 23 at the time. Ronnie was 24. We were pretty naive and didn't really know what we were doing, but we managed to. In those days, it was much easier. We got through to Dylan's management on the telephone. In fact, Dylan's actual manager, Albert Grossman, took our call. You'd never get that today. You wouldn't even find the phone number.
Going back, how did you get Jefferson Airplane?
Well, definitely that was a stroke of luck as well. Ronnie had found some London agent that put a whole bill of artists together, and they were the kind of the B and C listers of rock and pop at the time. There were some names like Fairport Convention who were just starting out, and The Move, and a group called Orange Bicycle. That was something to do with the Beatles Apple organization. They're very small acts that you could just book. And then this agency came to me and said, look, we've got an opportunity here. Jefferson Airplane are doing a tour in Europe with the Doors. And the Airplane are interested in finding another date for Britain. Would you be interested? And we snapped it up, basically. Anyway, basically, so a lot of bidding with Bob Dylan's management. Bear in mind, Bob Dylan was the biggest act in the world at that time. He'd not worked for 2.5 years. He'd had a motorcycle accident and people thought he'd never work again. There were people trying to get him from all over the world, and they'd just been battered away by the management. And how they managed to talk to us with such interest, I'm not sure, but they did. We put it to them that Bob Dylan could come to the Isle of Wight and have a holiday with his family, and we'll provide a manor house and a limousine with a chauffeur and a nanny for the children and so on, give the whole works, we can do all that and make a big occasion. And I think they liked the sound of that. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of other things going on in the background that we weren't aware of at the time that were hugely important in rock history, which is that the Woodstock Festival had been put in Dylan's backyard. Dylan lived in Woodstock. They thought it would bounce him into coming out to play. And he resented that really enormously. We had hippies invading his garden, and one of them got into his house. he really hated the whole thing. He later wrote in his book that Woodstock Festival was a sum total of all that bullshit, something like that. He said in his book about it. Anyway, he wanted to get out of Woodstock and do something else. His management were trying to get him back on stage, and his management was splitting up. The two guys, Albert Grossman I mentioned, who also lived in Woodstock, who had fallen out with Dylan, and they were virtually suing each other by then. And Grossman's partner, Bert Bloch, in New York, was the person I was talking to, and he was also able to talk to Dylan, whereas Grossman couldn't. So you've got this kind of peculiar setup going on, where Bert Bloch's wanting Dylan to get out on stage and start working again. He can talk to Dylan. Dylan's hating Woodstock. Grossman wants him to do Woodstock, but Grossman can't even talk to him. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Dylan agrees to do the Isle of Wight and get the hell out of there. He actually set sail. I didn't set sail. He boarded the QE2, the big ocean liner that had been launched that year. He boarded that on the day that the Woodstock Festival started, on the 15th of August, to come to England. And that was all part of our package. We got him a passage on the QE2. By coincidence, was sailing just at the right time. But his son got injured on the boat. A cabin door hit him, and he had to be taken off the ship and go to hospital. And so they had to leave and disembark, and we thought that was all scuppered. Anyway, they flew over the following week. But just to give you the timeline, they had literally boarded for England on the day that the Woodstock Festival started, Friday the 15th of August. Our festival is on his appearance on the 31st of August, so a couple of weeks later. So it all worked out all right in the end. Now that was huge. It was massive news in England. It was all over the papers. It was on the TV and the radio. It was international news that Bob Dylan was going to be performing. It was like we'd won the lottery, you know?
Yeah, I bet.
I can't even go into the financial side of it. We had to raise, in today's money, about £750,000 in the course of about 5 days. I had to fly to New York to sign contracts and meet Dylan, all in about space of about 5 days. And I didn't even have a passport. I'd never been abroad. I had to spend 2 of those days getting a passport and US visa together, and also helping to raise this money that I had to take with me. They told me to, don't forget the dollars, by the way, they said, when you're coming over. And we
they said that to you, if I remember, and you didn't have the dollars at all
any
on it
at that particular moment. But it all came to pass. We didn't have cash, but we got guarantees from people of substance, and that was enough. They accepted that, and we had 15 days to convert the guarantees into cash. Well, of course, the moment we signed the contract, tickets go on sale, and we've got a huge cash flow coming in, and we have cash flows enough to pay out this. As I say, it was £37,000. But today that would be about $250,000, and that all happened within a matter of a few weeks.
You were someone who was in the Isle of Wight, on the Isle of Wight, decided to put a festival on, just believed, yeah, do you know what? We can do this. Let's go after Bob Dylan. I mean, I don't think most people would have the self-belief or the courage to even come up with such a plan, especially in a situation where, you know, it sounds so impossible. It feels so impossible. Like, what were you thinking? Where did you get this tenacity from?
Well, I guess it was just a case of any port in a storm. You know, I think if we hadn't got Dylan, we may not have done a second Isle of Wight Festival, because it wasn't that viable with ordinary, you know, B-list artists. It needed something special. And if we didn't get Dylan, I didn't see that we didn't really have any money to finance it anyway. It was all on a wing and a prayer, really, trying to get Dylan. And we were just very lucky. But we were tenacious about it. And that summer, in June that year, there was the moon landing, when men walked on the moon. And we talked about this as though we got to deal with this like it's a military operation, like putting a man on the moon. You know, every detail's got to be right. And the communications back and forth to New York, with lots of documents and We printed a booklet, all sorts of things for us. We made a little film. It all had to be so carefully done, and we considered every detail as we went along. I exaggerated my age. I think I said I was 27.
How old were you?
We were supposed. I was 23.
23.
We were supposedly, straight up businessmen. I didn't have long hair. I wasn't a hippie or anything like that. I was probably the only person at the festival wearing a collar and tie. We put on an image of being respectable businessmen, and I think that Dylan's management wanted that. They didn't want sort of hippies coming along. Funny enough, the Woodstock people did go around like hippies, and they did the whole hippie thing all the time, and they had little sort of dope drawers in their office for their guests and all this sort of thing. When people visited them, they sort of just to make it look like they're really cool. Well, to my mind, that was not going to encourage serious businessmen to want to deal with you. But they seem to get away with it at Woodstock.
But with the Dylan Festival, how many people came to it?
Well, it was about 150,000.
50,000. So what did the residents of the Isle of Wight think of that?
Well, this was the next stage, and if I can plug my books at this point, the first book is called Stealing Dylan from Woodstock, and the second volume, it covers the 1970 event, and it's called The Last Great Event. Well, the first part of the story I've just given you about this whole process of getting Dylan and then the actual event itself. The second book is all about the battle to get the festival on, and the difficulty of dealing with the local authorities and the local residents. There was a campaign against this. We had to fight court injunctions. We had a terrible time for a whole year. It was like a battle raging, and we couldn't even find a festival site. Well, it was the last minute in July 1970 that we finally got a site. We were advertising tickets, and tickets were being sold, and the venue we just put down as the Isle of Wight. It didn't state a venue. It was only afterwards we realized the danger we were in, because what happened was that tickets had gone on sale, and they were selling very well. We'd had to pay artists deposits of substantial amounts. I mean, artists were typically about £10,000 each, and you'd pay 5,000 deposit. And all of that's coming out of ticket money. Now, had we failed to find a site and had to call the thing off at the last minute, we would not have been able to refund any tickets. There would have been a huge scandal, and we would have possibly been criminally liable for running a business in that way. There was a very dangerous situation we got ourselves into. But at the last minute, we did get a site, and it was a pretty good site in many ways. It had certain problems we could talk about, but it was, and it became a huge event. But if I can just backtrack for a minute, in January 1970, when we were considering how can we top Bob Dylan, have an artist of Bob Dylan's caliber or more, we couldn't. And so what we decided with this concept, and here's where critical mass comes in, the concept of a raft of artists. Now, by then, Bob Dylan's manager that I've been dealing with, Burt Block in New York, became our US agent for booking talent for 1970. That's how successful we've been with the Dylan people. And that was a major breakthrough. Plus the fact that a lot of artists were beating a path to our door to get on our festival. So it's quite easy to book acts. And we decided that we're going to get a raft of artists. And we got about 20 of the top artists in the world, what you might call the B-listers, after that top three that I mentioned. So, you've got Joni Mitchell, you've got The Doors, Jimi Hendrix, Leonard Cohen, Chicago, Miles Davis, of all people, and just an incredible bill of artists. You'll see them all in the book there. And it was just such a massive raft of artists. Had never been seen before like that. And apart from Woodstock had a similar bill, but we even outperformed Woodstock with the bill. Woodstock, of course, had been the year before. And so we were just now being noted as like the biggest festival in the world. Probably a bit like people talk about Glastonbury today. And and we pulled it off, and it did have this massive attendance. The figures of 600,000 is typical when people write about it, but that's probably double what it really was. It was probably more like about 300. But, it was difficult to know what the actual figures were. So many people arrived and didn't have tickets, and there was a huge hillside overlooking the site that became a grandstand. It was out of control in terms of ticketing. There was a massive event, but it was this critical mass of having to, get all those artists on there and put something on that would bring people across the water onto an island to come and see it.
I've got an image here that gives it a bit of context for everybody. Is quite how big it is that we're talking about, that Dad's talking about here. Hang on. You can see here people sat on the hill overlooking, and then all these people in the middle here. I mean, it's just insane.
You're only seeing about half of it there. Yeah, it was a mega event, and I think that when you get what we discovered was that when you get something that's really going to be big like that, it becomes self-promoting and self-advertising.
And that's what critical mass is, right?
Although we did do a lot of advertising, paid advertising, the coverage was enormous. I mean, I've still got all the press cuttings in our press cuttings archive, and every local paper in the country was reporting on it every week about the build-up, who the latest artists were, being booked, and we're drip all these artists out all summer. And I think we made a challenge for ourselves that we were going to get the front page of the Melody Maker every week, like about 20 weeks, something like that. I mean, it was.
Did you achieve that?
We did, more or less. I think we didn't get the main headline every week. We did many weeks, but we got mentioned on the front page every week, one way or another. And the way that worked, by the way, was that one of the key things about the Isle of Wight Festival was my brother Ronnie. It was tenacious in many ways, and one of the ways in which he was very effective was he was a former estate agent, and he knew about selling, he knew about business, and he was very business oriented, much more than me. And he ran the press department, and he just made it his business to get publicity. He knew that publicity meant sales, and it was all publicity driven. And they would cook up stories, all sorts of ridiculous stories were leaked out each week to get some publicity. I mean, there were stupid things. Some of them were really hideous. I mean, for instance, Tiny Tim was on the bill, and a story was put out that Tiny Tim had insisted that his cheque for payment should be written on the side of an elephant and would be personally presented at the bank. Now, that was completely absurd, but, the papers printed it. Just one springs to mind, but the various sort of daft things like that were coming up.
Looking back then, especially around critical mass, what do you feel the key lessons from the Isle of Wight Festival are that you feel are still relevant today? Because obviously there are some things that aren't. Like, you can't call Bob Dylan's manager. There's probably a higher barrier to entry to get through to some people, but just in general.
I mean, I do hear stories regularly nowadays of people who've done this sort of thing and managed to get through to important people and present something to them and get them involved. I mean, that does happen. It's not easy. It was really easy in those days. It's not easy now, but it can be done. So don't rule that out totally. I frequently hear it when you listen to things like Desert Island Discs and people telling their story of where the breakthrough came, and it was often by contacting the right person, getting through to them. I think this publicity is a hugely important thing to find ways of getting your product out there without having to pay, because, I mean, advertising is really, really expensive. Free advertising is often much more effective than paid advertising because it can reach a lot more people, and it goes with a certain amount of authority because it's like editorial rather than paid advertising. So publicity is very, very important. But I can give you another example of, if I can sort of fast forward now 50 years or more, one of the things I've been involved with in the last 3 or 4 years is the Oxford Independent Book Fair, which I formed with 3 partners. And we put on this event every year for independent writers and publishers and printers and people in the indie world rather than the big established publishing houses. And the first couple of them we put on at was effectively a church hall, but quite a big church hall. We had about 40 stall holders. And my instincts were that this is never going to work unless we can move to a bigger venue, because we need this critical mass. We need to get it so big that it becomes self-publicizing, that everybody knows about it and that the media write about it. And my partners were very hesitant. They didn't like to sort of talk at all.
Very frustrating for such a visionary like yourself.
Well, they just thought I was a bit of a megalomaniac. And because I've been doing Isle of Wight festivals, I was liable to go over the top with the book fair. But we did last year move to a bigger venue. We moved to the university examination halls, which is a very big, grand venue. And we more or less doubled the number of stalls. And it was a big, successful event. And in November, we're going to have double the number of halls in that complex, and probably double the number again, and by which time it'll be really big. And I believe that it'll be big enough to have sort of more national interest from even the national press, and it will become notable as a national event rather than a local event, because there aren't such events going on anywhere as far as I can see. And the stall holders are kind of queuing up to get into it, so there's no trouble about letting the stalls. It's having the size of the venue. And it becomes quite a big event. So it's the same principle, really. You get it so big that it's self-promotional, because you can't afford to spend money advertising.
So what are the steps then? Because we've got lots of people here that are running events. You know, I run events, online ones, but they're events nonetheless. We've got lots of coaches, mentors, authors, PR specialists, people with, you know, lots of different specialties in the Rebellious Business Network and the people that will be listening to this episode. If they were putting on shows, if they're putting on events of some kind, what would be your advice for them to start thinking bigger and start thinking about, right, critical mass, where something becomes self-publicizing because it's so big? How do I achieve that? What are the steps?
Well, I think the world today is so different because of social media that's probably where you've got to look. And I would suggest it's a matter of getting a following on social media one way or another, and you know, having a following that you can then send out information to and keep them engaged. That seems to be what works for a lot of people. I have an example. I mean, you're the Rebellious Business Network, but there's a firm that I know called Guerrilla Publishing, which is the same sort of thing, and they're dealing with independent writers and publishers, and it's all about getting social media coverage and building up followings and different ways of doing it. And I'm sure that you're already doing this as best you can. Things like promotional things with some free gifts or special deals, whatever, special interest things to keep people engaged. That I would thought was the equivalent today. And it depends on the business as well, of course. I mean, all these businesses are different, and putting on rock and roll events are probably very different to, I don't know, publishing a book or making a product that you're going to sell. And I suppose I've learned lots of little rules in business that seem to me self-evident. The people that really make it big, they don't make it big because they've got a magic product that everybody wants. It's a great product. They make it big because they find a way of selling. It's the selling that makes them big. So you need the product, of course, but it's how you sell it and being able to sell it that makes you hit the big time. You've got to have those sales. And no matter how good your product is, if nobody knows about it or it doesn't sell, it's not going to get you anywhere.
But of course, you can sell a lot of an awful product and then get a load of negative word of mouth happening.
Well, it's got to be decent. I'm not saying you can just do with a rubbish product. You've got to have a decent product, of course. Yeah. That goes without saying. But it doesn't matter how great your product is. If you don't make the sales, and it's not really getting you very far. And you can look at people like Richard Branson, for instance, or although, by the way, there is an example of somebody who made it big selling crap products, and that was Alan Sugar. with his, it was Amstrad, wasn't it? He started out with, and these sort of stereo systems that were pretty ropey, to say the least. They're cheap and ropey, and he managed to sell them. So you can have a cheap and ropey product that will sell, and you can make it big. But by and large, you've got to have a decent product.
The interesting thing about that example is we remember him more than we remember the stereos. So is there also an element of he was very good at creating a lot of PR and whatever about his personal brand and about him, and that's how.
I think that was stage 2 in his story, where he'd already become quite a big shot, and he was already, multimillionaire, successful. Mm-hmm. He starts doing a TV program, which is licensed from Donald Trump, who'd been running the same thing in America for 18 years or many years at that time. And so The Apprentice was an American product that they decided to do in Britain. They're looking around for a businessman that could run it, and they chose him. Now, that made him ultra famous, of course. But prior to that program, not many people would have known his name, I would have thought.
Yeah.
But he had already made it big. He made it big with Amstrad and then other electronic stuff. So whether it was later any good or not, I don't know. But certainly the early Amstrad thing was pretty ropey end of the market.
So going back to the book fair, you said that you wanted to make the book fair critical mass, but you were coming up against other people that were worried it was going to be, too big an idea, and they wanted to kind of keep it small. I feel like that's quite relevant for the general landscape of business owners. I know there are a lot of people that really want to become very successful, but they're scared to get out in front of the camera for the first time, or, don't feel confident in themselves to do that. For instance, having a really big audience the idea of it can be terrifying, because you also can get a lot of negative comments and people troll on the internet these days. What would you say to someone who wants that, who wants to have a big audience, but is scared to? Like, they feel a bit freaked out by the idea of having that large audience, or getting out in front of that camera, or being that person that's very well known. And maybe for a number of reasons. Maybe they've got fear of failure. Maybe they've got fear of success. Maybe they're people pleasers and worried about upsetting people or having people that don't like them. There can be a number of reasons. What would you say to someone that wants that, but they're a bit fearful of going for it?
Well, that's a difficult question, because that involves people's personality, and if you've got a fear of speaking to an audience, for instance, and your work requires you to do so, then that could be, if you've got a phobia about that, it could be a problem. You might need some counselling or something. I don't know, but that's extreme. But basically, I think it's important not to be a person that's not willing to be intimidated. I would say it's really important that you've got to stick to what you believe in and not care about what stupid people have to say. I mean, you can't be intimidated by people trolling you or whatever. As long as you do things with integrity, and I mean, if you're doing really bad things and get caught out, and then it all goes on social media, then that would be embarrassing and damaging, and would be your own fault. But if you do things with integrity, and you try and treat people decently, treat your customers decently, really important, then it will pay off in the end, and you should be quite fearless as you go forward and not be intimidated. And the trouble is, there's so many idiots out there that are willing to try and intimidate you and come out with stupid remarks. And some people are sensitive and they take it badly. But we had, going back to the Isle of Wight in 1970, got this raft of artists of a 5-day festival with free camping, lots of facilities, everything you can imagine, and the tickets were £4 each. Now, okay, we had inflation since then, but it was the price of a double album, right? So compared with today's festivals, I mean, they're typically £200 or £300 straight off, aren't they? And that may not even include camping. Well, £4 was really cheap, but people were still complaining, saying that it was a rip-off, and that music should be free, and we were just coining it in at their expense, and all sorts of accusations. Well, we were quite fearless about carrying on and not being intimidated by that sort of thing. So I think what we were doing, we really were trying to offer good value, and we did provide good value. Obviously, I mean, it speaks for itself, doesn't it? You get all those artists for a 5-day festival for £4. We were treating our customers really well. So I think that's a really important thing. I think the same with our book fair today. My priority is trying to get sales for our customers, are the stall holders that pay us to have a stall. And my priority is to try and make sure that they have a good deal and they make some sales. It's worth their while. So you've really got to try and look after your customers, basically. Really important. And you do it with integrity. And then if you're getting sniping about it coming from the sideline, just ignore that, because if you know you're doing the right thing, I don't think you should worry. That would be my advice. But that may be easier said than done in some situations.
Yeah. There are always going to be people that say negative stuff. I've had people comment on my videos saying that this is back when I was affiliate marketing. My parents would be ashamed of me if they knew I was such a con artist. I've also been accused of being a sex offender. I mean, I found that one astounding. You get all sorts of ridiculous comments and people saying all sorts of things, and it's quite baffling. But I also see it as a sign that you are starting to get big, because critical mass surely comes with two sides. I mean, when you were getting critical mass with the Isle of Wight Festival, there was obviously a lot of people that had some things to say about you bringing all those people to such a small island. I mean, it's probably the first time so many people had even been on that island in history, surely. And there comes with a side of negativity. And I think that what you're saying about don't let the bastards get you down, be strong. Don't let people intimidate you. I think it's really, really important, because if you feel like you're in alignment with your integrity, your values are in the right place, you're doing the right thing, then everybody else's opinion is just an opinion.
That's right. And I think that by and large, we did ignore the kind of critics that were saying offensive things, for instance, and saying that all these people coming along were going to bring disease. And well, I mean, might seem hard to believe, but the local bus company, the Isle of Wight Bus Company, advertised in the local paper after the event to assure people that following the festival, that all the buses have been used, have been disinfected.
Oh my God.
Right. So it gives you an idea of what kind of mindset there was among certain people in those days. I mean, I don't think you'd get anything like that today. And it's as though these people were really sort of foul sort of creatures that were going to come and bring disease. I mean, people wrote to the local paper in droves about the disease that was going to be brought, sexually transmitted diseases, especially, and bringing drugs to the Isle of Wight and corrupting all our young people. I mean, just endless stuff like that. And of course, it was quite laughable in a way, but at the same time, we did have a serious opposition that we had to fight. I mean, you've got to brush that aside and just got to do what you do with integrity and do the right thing.
So we throw the word rebellious around a lot here. It's a word that's used in almost every sentence. What does being rebellious mean to you?
I think you've got to be willing to challenge the status quo, the way people normally assume that you do things. And I do a lot of rebellious things in my life. For instance, 30, 40 years ago, I decided, and our family decided at the time, that we were not going to buy any more Christmas presents. that was
my childhood, ladies and gentlemen.
It was a hideous thing to do. That people buying stuff for people that didn't want the stuff, people didn't care, to impress people that didn't care. I mean, and there's a competitive element in the family, and we just didn't want to be a part of it, and we just sucked into it by social norms.
Yeah,
I can remember marching you into Oxfam when you were about 10 years old and handing over £100 and say, look, this is the money I might have spent on your Christmas present, but it's going to children who've got absolutely nothing. and trying to get to understand that. And it was, so that's rebellious in a way. And I'm the only one in the family that's kept it up, I should add. Well, everybody else caved in after a few years. They couldn't handle it because they're getting criticisms. And my dear mother, who late mother, would say things like, well, we like to give, we prefer to be generous, and thinking that that's what it's all about. Didn't understand.
But it is true, isn't it? I mean, I think we worry too much about what other people will think. I mean, yeah, I know that right. You definitely had some stick about your view on Christmas presents in the past, but you stand firm because that's what you believe in. And I really admire that about you.
Well, that's one example. I mean, a number of things I could point to, but rebelliousness in business, again, you don't have to accept all the norms. You have to keep within the law and certain conventions of politeness and, just obvious social conventions. But by and large, you've got to do your own thinking. One of the most informative things that happened to me, by the way, when I was 16 and I started working as an apprentice in a newspaper, I was a printer. I did a 5-year apprenticeship, but I met this fellow apprentice who was a bit older, and he had a little saying all about the importance of having a mind of your own. And he was always talking about having a mind of your own, and it really impressed me as a 16-year-old, and I was stuck with it all my life, and so that's really important, have a mind of your own.
Yeah.
And
quite basic, really, but actually...
No, basic, but
a lot of people don't. They just follow the crowd.
Too quick to just assume. Later on, I did a university course on popular culture. It was also very informative and impressive on me. And it was all about the kind of things, do you know what the dominant ideology is? The dominant ideology are those things that we do, which we regard as being common sense. Now, okay, well, it's common sense, for instance, that we buy Christmas presents. Well, is that really common sense? I mean, that's a dominant ideology, but you can always buck the trend of the dominant ideology. It's common sense that the man of the household will carve the turkey, for instance. I mean, that sort of thing that we always do, or that
you're trying to say the woman will be in the kitchen doing the cooking, wondering if it's going to be socially acceptable.
So all of these norms that we regard as being common sense, that then they don't necessarily hold good all the time, and you should be ready to challenge them. They say do your own thinking and make your own judgments, and don't just go along with what everybody's always told you to think.
So does that mean you always kind of should really have a reason for why you're doing it, so that you can back yourself up, not only in defending yourself in front of others, but in defending yourself to yourself when you'll start to question, shit, am I doing the right thing? Would you say that you always have a reason and you work out a reason for something?
Yeah, well, maybe. I mean, let me give you another example, which is slightly off the topic, but or maybe on the topic. When I was about 30, I'd already been married and divorced, and I was in a settled relationship. And I saw an item on television, a little sort of magazine item. This couple they're actually living in a caravan, and they're married, and they decided to get divorced. And they were getting divorced to show each other how much they loved each other, because they wanted to say, we're staying together because we want to be together, not because of a bit of paper that says we're married. And they actually went and got divorced. Now, I thought that was the most romantic thing I ever heard. Now, that completely flies in the face of convention, doesn't it, and what you're told you've got to do. And from that moment onwards, I've always been a little bit skeptical about the institution of marriage, about whether it's, that useful a thing, and whether, you should be in a relationship that you stay in because every day you earn the right to be in it, not because you've got a marriage certificate. And then that can make your life more valuable. So is that a way of being rebellious?
Yeah. Well,
not everybody would agree with that. And you certainly shouldn't force your opinions on somebody else either. I mean, that would be a bad thing to do.
It's really interesting for me hearing the way that you're describing rebellious? Because I mean, as you say, there are so many contexts and so many ways in which that word is used, and it is just a word from the dictionary. But the way that we use it is that it's about being the wildest, most extreme version of you, or really being yourself in a world where you have been expected to, and maybe you've wanted to for a lifetime, fit in to society, to school, to university, to the mums in the mum circle, or the dads on the golf course. I'm being stereotypical now, but basically it's an act of rebellion to then have a business, and you realize when you start this business, you're like, oh my God, I actually need to stand out because people need to know I exist. This blending in is not going to be helpful for me now. In order to achieve critical mass, in order for the press to write something about you, in order for you to actually sell your books, or for you to get people watching your videos, there's got to be something different about you. And I feel that there already is. You don't need to change who you are, because the thing that's different about you is the fact that you are a unique individual with your unique experience, with your unique personality. And yeah, we've all got a doppelganger somewhere, but we're all pretty individual and pretty unique. And so if you step into really being yourself, and you fearlessly and courageously do that, you challenge the status quo by challenging it not for the sake of it, but because actually that's not what you think or what you believe, or you think there's a better way of doing something, then you're stepping into that. And I feel like that is a real act of rebellion, especially if you've had a lifetime of feeling like you just needed to fit in. I don't know if you have, Dad, had a lifetime of needing to fit in. I don't think that's something that's in your dictionary, but I think for a lot of us, it really has been.
In some ways you do need to fit in, but in other ways you don't. And you've got to do your own thinking and base your ideas and conclusions on something substantial. I mean, another example in my life, if for what it's worth, is that if you take motoring, now I've been a lifelong motorist, and I have a car, and I don't drive as much as I used to, but I do drive. I'm aware that there are problems with driving because there are too many cars on the roads, and they cause pollution and all the rest of it, and all the bad things about cars. Now, I'm in favour of the government doing everything they can to crack down on the motorist, to deter the motorists from driving unnecessarily, and to make motoring even more expensive, even though it's going to hit me. So you can believe in something and just go through with it, and be willing to go through with it, and just face up to your beliefs. And I think that's an example for me where, you can be doing one thing, but you know that it's not necessarily a good thing, and it needs the government to crack down on you to stop you doing it. And not complain about it. Now, most motorists are really complaining about whenever something's done to curb their activities, where it's like more difficulty in parking, or more costs on fuel or whatever. And everybody's moaning about it. But the reality is, if you need to be brutally honest with yourself and know that there's got to be a good thing, because there are too many big problems facing us with all our roads being chock-a-block and can't move around properly, apart from the pollution and everything else. So that's the kind of way in which you can be honest with yourself. And even though it might go against you, you've still got to be honest with yourself, and let that sort of help you make your decisions. And how that relates to business, I'm not sure.
Well, that was a kind of personal side of how you live your life, isn't it? But then there's, we were talking earlier about with business, you need to put yourself out there. We've got social media these days, and it is more important than ever before that your business is relatable to humans. It is a kind of personal touch, that you're looking after clients in a very personal way, no matter if you're corporate or whether you're an individual solopreneur. The human element of business is very, very important, because we are selling to people, and creating that connection is really important. And I believe that as solopreneurs, building a personal brand, we have a massive advantage on the big companies, because it's very difficult for them to be human. They're a big, big organization, whereas we are 1, 2, maybe 3 people max. And it's much easier for us to really be ourselves, which makes us more relatable, allows people to connect to us. But in order to do that, there is an element of needing to get over yourself. be okay with yourself, needing to know who you are, know what your values are, and support yourself. And that can be very difficult, especially if you're someone that's from a people-pleasing background.
I find it difficult to say things that relate to the businesses of your community, not knowing what they all are and what kind of business we're talking about.
Yeah.
I can only speak very, very generally about how things have applied to me. I think there are many episodes in my life where I have been over, and I just completed my memoirs, and the title of it is The Incurable Optimist. And I've gone into projects really optimistic about what I can do repeatedly, and often come unstuck, and sometimes got some measure of success. But I've also found, thinking about my life story, that I've been a serial failure in my life. In as much as, of all the projects I've been involved in, and there are probably about 6 or 8 major projects I've been involved in, very different sort of things, that have, one way or another, have not been sustainable. And so I've then moved on to something else. Now, I haven't moved on to something else because I got fed up and bored. I've moved on because I've reached the point where this is no longer sustainable. So therefore, you could say it's a failure, even though in some ways it may have succeeded and maybe made quite a lot of money or whatever, or achieved some of its objectives.
Depends what your measurement of success is, I guess.
Well, I think the measurements in business, if you think of the great business people like Richard Branson, somebody, they've been involved in projects. They've been sustainable. Mm-hmm. And they've built and built and built, and they've become sort of multi-billionaires. With my projects, they've not been sustainable, and I have to start again on something different and something new. So I don't know, but each one, I think there's a pattern where I've been over ambitious. I think the Isle of Wight Festival is a case in point where we didn't do the small steps that a normal business would do. We went off like a rocket, and then within 2 years, it was only 2 years, I think it was 2 years and 1 month from the first festival to the third, we kind of came unstuck and we couldn't do those anymore. Now, there are promoters about. I mean, Harvey Goldsmith, I don't know if everybody knows who Harvey Goldsmith is, but he's probably about the biggest promoter in the world. He did Live Aid and all sorts of things. And he was somebody we worked with early on in London in 1971. And he was just starting out in those days. And he was doing promotions in small clubs and things, and built up a promotion business. And over time, over a 50-year career, becomes the biggest promoter in the world. Well, all of what I've done, I've tried to do things too quickly and gone off like a rocket, and then it's not been sustainable.
That is, I've seen so many companies grow very fast and fall very, very hard.
So I think the small steps are really important. Not all the time, but invariably, you got to make the first small steps and build up, and not expect to go off like a rocket. I remember when we were doing. I started an environmental charity called the Millennium Debate at the beginning of the century. And I had this idea that within a very short period of time, we would be the biggest website on the World Wide Web, that would have be bigger than the BBC and bigger than anybody could mention on the internet. And of course, it didn't happen, not remotely. But that was the kind of ambition I had in my mind, that we could do this. And I had ways in which we were going to do it. It didn't work.
But you achieved a lot with that. I don't know how much.
Yeah, we did achieve quite a lot. We did achieve a lot with that charity and that project, and it did run for about 7 years. But with that, I'm highlighting that particular ambition about being the biggest website in the world.
Yeah.
Think, well, everybody cares about the environment, so everybody's going to be interested in this, because we all have to live in the environment. So, it's this kind of naive. You think at my age, I would have learnt a thing or two, but it
was also in a time though where it wasn't. I mean, it's only recently. Back then, when you were doing, I mean, I was a child when you were doing all the environmental stuff, and it wasn't widely accepted or talked about. It was seen as something very left wing, very hippie like. It's a lot more sort of normal discussion these days. I mean, we didn't even have recycling back then.
No. Well. It brings me to another of my little sayings, which is never be a pioneer. But again, I don't want to put people off being a pioneer, but That's been my experience, that you pioneer something and then before you know it, it's not worked out like you thought. And then somebody else is doing it later that picks it up and runs with it, and they do make a success of it.
We have a question in relation to that from John asking, but the festival is still going. Why is your dad still not making income from it? And or why is he not involved in it anymore? Well, I mean, that's a huge story in and of itself.
Okay, well, just very quickly on that, following the 1970 festival, there was an act of parliament that banned festivals in the Isle of Wight effectively for the next 30 years. We brought about, sort of the Isle of Wight bill became law, and we couldn't hold festivals in the way that we had. It was picked up in the Queen's Jubilee in 2002 by the council itself, who did a deal with the London promoter, John Giddings at Solo, and started it up again quite independently of us. So it's nothing to do with us anymore, although we did get some small recompense for copyright items. But we got stopped, basically.
What impact do you feel like the Isle of Wight Festival had on the festival world? And how did it change the face of that? Did it have any impact on it?
Oh, I think it did. I mean, for instance, the Bob Dylan Festival, I think, was the first real camping festival. And because it's on an island, people had to camp. You couldn't go home at night, which is what previous festivals had done. A lot of people would go home at night and come back the next day if it was going to be running for more than one day. So we had to provide campsites, and that kind of held it in the camping festival. It also put festivals on the map as a thing, that happens in a big way. Prior to that, it had been a very niche thing nobody had even heard of. The idea of having rock and roll acts in a field, it was all very, very small time. So it really did put it on the map. But with Glastonbury started up the following year by two people who at the Isle of Wight who went off to say, we're going to do a festival and we're going to do it properly and we're going to make it free. And they put on a free festival at Glastonbury in 1971. And they had David Bowie and they had various other acts. And they just lost a fortune, lost all their money. And then that was the end of that. And it was about 7 or 8 years later that Michael Eavis decided to do his own festival at Glastonbury. So the first Glastonbury festival did come out of the Isle of Wight indirectly. But it was 7 or 8 years later that Michael Eavis decided to do it.
Tell us about one of the most unforgettable moments from the festival that still makes you smile today.
Well, I mean, one of the things I have written about is when I arrived in 1969 to the Bob Dylan Festival on the Friday evening. And Bob Dylan's going to be appearing on the Sunday. So the first day of the festival, in other words, Friday evening, I've been in the office all day. And we drive to the site along these country lanes, and there are hippies everywhere, and it's a job to get through with the car. And I got to the backstage. We were driving alongside the walls to the arena, so you couldn't really see what's going on the other side of the wall. And I was kind of ushered into the backstage area, and up onto the back of the stage, up this ramp. And the compere said, come and have a look at this. And he took me round to the wings of the stage. And suddenly I got this view of people as far as the horizon. And the sheer shock of that, and this feeling that we've done it, we've done it. And also this feeling of sort of slight trepidation that this is now happening and it's going to take its own course. There's no one human being that's going to change the course of this now. It's going to take its own course. There's so many people involved, and we didn't have communications in those days. We didn't have walkie-talkies, and it was just going to take its course with this feeling of, wow, what a thing. And just the sight of this audience, like an ocean of people in front of me. The sheer shock of that. It was a very happy moment in a way.
I can't imagine how that felt. That is insanely amazing.
I'll give you one more moment that when we heard that Bob Dylan would accept our offer, he was going to do it, I had a phone call from Burt Block manager, and he said, hey, Ray, I've sent you a telegram. I've been trying to get through on the phone all afternoon. I couldn't get through because of the international lines or something. I said, oh, really? What's happening? He said, well, I'll read you the telegram. And it said, Bob Dylan and the band will accept. And I said, wow. And that was a fantastic moment. I was standing there with this phone in my hand talking to him, and he was running through a load of details about things. And then he said, and next Tuesday, we need you here in New York to bring a lawyer to sign the contracts, blah, 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 and all this stuff. This is on a Wednesday, right? He wanted me there next Tuesday. And he said, and Bob wants to meet you. At which point I had to sit down.
By the way, my dad is the biggest fan of Bob Dylan. Always has been, always will be.
So well, it would be, but I wasn't prior to that. Prior to all of this bidding for Bob Dylan, I didn't know anything about him. I was not a fan. And it was only in the course of talking to his management that I was one by one going into the record store and buying another album of his and listening to it, and gradually realized, what was special about him. It grew on me over a period of a couple of months, and from not knowing anything whatsoever about him, I just heard his name, of course, and that was about all. I didn't know what all the fuss was about, and it did actually enlighten me to what all the fuss was about. Okay.
Dad, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me, and good luck everybody who's listening in, and I hope your businesses go incredibly well in 2024.